Hello. Let me welcome you to this discussion of President Biden's trip to the Middle East, sponsored by the Gulf International Forum, which wants us to consider how this trip may have affected the very challenged U.S. Saudi relationship. Has President Biden succeeded or not? And in what ways might he have succeeded, and in what ways might he have failed? We have a superb panel to address this question. You have their bios. I'm going to just say a quick word about each just before each one speaks. We're going to begin with Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen, who is Baker Institute Fellow for the Middle East at Rice University and non-resident Senior Fellow at the Gulf International Forum. He happens to be in Cambridge today. Dr. Ulrichsen, what I want to know is, what were Biden's strategic objectives from this visit? Can they be achieved? How does Washington view its relations with Saudi Arabia in the short and long term? And frankly, how does Washington view this trip?
Well, thank you for having me and for putting this panel together. You mentioned about the perceptions of success and determining whether the trip is a success or a failure. And I think that very much depends on who's doing the grading and what question you're asking. And I think one of the difficulties the administration was having beforehand was in trying to put together a coherent narrative about why it was suddenly felt necessary to go to the Middle East in the middle of one of the hottest summers on record, and to, well, certainly in the Saudi case, to do an about turn and to meet with Mohammed bin Salman, although also with the Israelis as well. There had been, when Biden came into office in 2021, if you remember correctly, there was at least a month before Biden even spoke to Benjamin Netanyahu. So even that was taken as a sign of at least a diplomatic iciness in relationships with the Biden administration felt with key Middle Eastern partners. So I think the administration was struggling to define a messaging campaign. Now, clearly, the impact of geopolitical events, the impact of the Russian war in Ukraine, the associated dislocation of energy and economic markets around the world, and the ongoing supply chain distortions and crises, obviously now with food and inflationary pressures as well, I think that it all contributed to a perception that Biden had to be seen to be doing something. But then, of course, the notion that Biden would be going to Saudi Arabia to effectively ask the Saudis to produce more oil would, I think, have caused significant damage to Biden politically among many of his base in the Democratic coalition of party supporters, especially among progressives and among people who obviously think that the U.S. Gulf or Saudi relations should be somewhat different. So with that in mind, I think the focus was very much then put on normalization, which ironically, given that in Biden's Washington Post article justifying the trip, he couldn't even bring himself to mention Donald Trump by name. He just referred to him as my predecessor, but almost by default pursuing and advancing the Abraham Accords, or at least aspects of normalization, became one of the key themes for bringing the two components of the trip, Israel, Palestine, and the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, together. I think the challenge for the White House, for the administration, was that on all of these issues, and there were those, of course, also other states in the region putting forward their own aspirations in advance of the trip. The Israeli defense minister and the King of Jordan both talked about deepening security and defense cooperation. The possibility was raised of an Arab NATO, which I never thought was particularly likely, given that the Middle East Strategic Alliance, which the Trump administration had prioritized in 2018-19, couldn't come to an agreement on many of the key security and defense and threat perceptions facing the region. And that was without getting the Israelis or the Iraqis involved. It was just the GCC plus Egypt and Jordan, and in that case it was Egypt that left. So I never thought there was much chance of a significant breakthrough that would justify having the meeting at such a time, or perhaps with events that could have been handled at a lower level. We've seen, for example, a CIA director and administration officials in Riyadh over the past months working on painstaking negotiations, but nothing that would necessarily justify a presidential summit. So with that in mind, I think we've seen in the last 2 days especially how White House and Saudi accounts of what may or may not have been discussed in the bilateral meetings have differed quite sharply, especially on whether or not there was a commitment to increase oil production, whether or not that will be a commitment now in the future, or just a commitment to increase capacity, which isn't the same as increasing production. We've seen the Saudis reiterating the importance of maintaining OPEC Plus, which by definition includes Russia. We've seen the Emiratis say that they will continue to at least explore diplomatic engagement with Iran. We saw, I think, the Iraqi president today calling for an inclusive security apparatus in the Gulf, including Iran. So we've seen, I think, how this trip has perhaps highlighted the areas of divergence rather than convergence, and highlighted them in perhaps ways that are now more visible for the meeting having happened, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, except that I think one of the critiques of the trip from the White House perspective was that they didn't seem to take into account so much of what was happening in the Gulf region anyway, regardless of the US. There's been so many talks and dialogues and de-escalation mechanisms in multiple directions, and much of it since 2019 has really been based on the assumption that, or at least the perception that the US is going to disengage from the Gulf at some point in time, and that it's therefore incumbent on participants in regional affairs to sort of sort out their own affairs without necessarily having the US front and center in it. But then, of course, with the summit, the US became front and center, and of course those divergences perhaps became much more visible. Going forward, in terms of what happens next, I think what is striking, apart from the fact that Biden has had by default to effectively recognize that he has had to bow to realpolitik and to engage with Mohammed bin Salman as a de facto head of government, especially if not yet head of state in Saudi Arabia, after having said for almost 2 years that he wouldn't do so. But I think what happens next is also that with no sign coming of any end to the energy crisis, especially in Europe, and with signs that that crisis will become much more of an issue going forward, I think there's a sense in the Gulf that the Gulf states are back as kind of major regional participants, and they cannot be sidelined. And I don't think, again, that was a message the Biden administration came into office trying to seek. They were trying to move away from the Middle East. They were hoping that they could focus on other issues elsewhere. And I think, again, just the last 6 months especially has made it's certainly a very different narrative than, say, 12 months ago, with the talk about climate proposals and energy transitions. And we're now seeing the Gulf back front and center in these respects. And so I think that's something that will define the next phase of US Gulf relations going forward.
Thank you so much, Professor Ulrichsen. You've reconfirmed my conviction that preceded this meeting, that you're somebody who always has interesting things to say about the Gulf. So more divergence than convergence, and a lot of change in administration attitudes. I'll turn next to Professor Alshayji, who is the former chairman and director of the graduate program of the Political Science Department at Kuwait University. He is somebody who we all listen to when it comes to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and other places as well in the Gulf. But what do we think Riyadh expected from Biden's visit, and how do Saudi views diverge from those of Washington on foreign policy generally, and how can this collaboration continue with so much divergence evident? Professor Alshayji?
Thank you very much, Professor Serwer, and I'm really happy and glad to be a panelist among our distinguished panelists here. I know some of you guys, and this is the talk of the town here and everywhere in the region. I mean, from the very beginning, I think President Biden was not happy or willing to visit the region. The timing was very awkward. The mission was not very coherent and very straight. There were a lot of leaks in the U.S. press, Israeli also, Channel 12 and other platforms talking about integration, talking about Israel's role in an alliance, a regional defense alliance, coordination in terms of anti-Iranian missiles and drones. So we were really discussing all these issues about a month before President Biden landed in the region. And we were not really expecting much from the same old approach. And the visit by itself per se has validated and confirmed the vision that United States is back to realpolitik, triumphed what the a former U.S. Secretary of State Condi Rice stated at the American University in Cairo, that my country, the United States, for at that time 50 years, have traded freedom and democracy to security and stability. And after 50 years, we've achieved neither. And I don't think President Biden and his administration has learned the lesson that we are back to square one. The visit was really he was trounced in the U.S. press before the visit. Think tanks also argued about the validity and was the visit worth it. And even after he departed, Washington Post, New York Times, even the liberal media platforms and think tanks were really very harsh on criticizing him, and the Washington Post today, New York Times, and what have you. So the visit was really a triumph for the status quo, for realpolitik. The three U.S. administrations back to back from Obama to Trump to and now Biden and even Clinton and somehow have downgraded the relevance and the priority and the value of the region, downgraded us, downgraded the whole region, talking about countering Russia before invading Ukraine and countering China, pivoting towards Asia. And it seems that there is a curse here. Every time a U.S. administration tries to pivot away from our region, it's pulled back by realpolitik and by the divergence issues that we see. There is a growing, as I argued in a piece back in 2014 in Middle East policy, for a reset. We were hoping for a reset of the GCC-U.S. relations. But unfortunately, we haven't seen that. Yes, President Biden talked about America is back, but then he answered his slogan, for how long? And that's really the question, is for how long? Even though President Biden tried to allay the fears of the GCC leaders and plus three that held the summit in Jeddah the next day after he arrived, after meeting King Salman and the actual day-to-day running the show in Saudi Arabia. And the press talked about more. I mean, unfortunately, talked more about the fist pump and talked about Khashoggi and talked about body language, rather than talking about the substantive issues. And that was really shocking. I mean, how could President Biden fist pump MBS, and how could he not bring up the issue? And the first question that he was asked, Biden was asked when he landed at the White House, was Khashoggi and the Saudi foreign minister talking about, was it a priority, was it on top of the agenda as President Biden? And that was really unfortunate, the hanging on the issue of Khashoggi and human rights issues and neglecting all the issues. President Biden tried, but I don't think he succeeded in insisting that we're not going anywhere. We have invested in the region, and we are going to stay, and we are going to help you guys with your military and security issues. But there is no substantive results. I mean, he prioritized Israel's security. He first few minutes after he arrived, he really provoked the whole region by repeating his, it seems, one of the favorite slogans: you don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist. And that was really, he was off from the start. And then he did not talk about the two-state solution. He did talk about asking Israel to stop the illegal settlements. He did not even meet with the family of the slain Palestinian American Al Jazeera reporter Shireen Abu Akleh, which really captivated the whole region back in May. He didn't ask Israelis to really give anything in return for a two-state solution. And that was, he was off from the very start. And then when he arrived in Saudi Arabia, I mean, I don't think there is a confidence building measures. We are back to politics as usual. I mean, he seems to believe that the region, and especially the Saudis, probably are betting on the Republican administration coming back. I mean, the issues that really propelled President Biden to come to the region, especially to Saudi Arabia, to Jeddah. By the way, your title should be Jeddah, not Riyadh. And was the three issues, in my opinion, was the war in the Russian war against Ukraine, the issue of oil and energy security, and the crazy increase in prices for gas and oil in the whole world. Oil security, food security, the price I just got from United States a month ago. And I've been living and going back and forth to the States since the early 80s. And I haven't seen the Americans are so down and so upset, and so the popularity of President Biden or any U.S. president so low. The gas price is like $6. And my son in California, he fills up his car with $7 a gallon for a premium gas. I mean, this is unbelievable. Inflation is topping 40 years, 9.1 last month. And that was the reason he came, in my opinion. He came to shore up his popularity, to be, on the world stage, to ask the Saudis and the GCC countries to increase their oil production, knowing that there is limited capacity for any increase. I mean, he really lost an opportunity that should have been seized upon to try to confirm or to give some kind of substantive assurances for the region and for the countries. He also has not, in my opinion, succeeded in detaching the neutrality of the Saudis and the Emiratis and the GCC in general from taking any tough position vis-a-vis Russia. President Putin will be visiting Iran tomorrow, I think, and he will be also on the stage again and challenging President Biden. But frankly, and I will end up with this, the Russia and China are having really a show in this region. Remember, China signed 25-year deal of the century with the Iranians over $400 billion. And now President Biden with the G7 in Germany last month are trying to counter China with their global initiative for infrastructure helping developing countries. So in sum, I would argue that the visit was a lost opportunity. We are back to politics as usual from U.S. perspective. There is no confidence building measures that really beyond rhetoric and beyond going back to old approach of United States. And the region is still, Iranians are happy now to see the Saudis opening up, extending their hands. There is no NATO Arab or Middle Eastern alliance, as the Saudi foreign minister confirmed. There is no GCC Israeli military coalition to counter Iran. And at the end of the day, even the Emiratis will be sending an ambassador. Qatar and all, I will finish it with this, Dr. Serwer. Qatar, Kuwait, even Saudi Arabia, with opening up its airspace to the Israeli airlines, will not normalize, or the new term now, integrate, rather than normalization. It's now integration, playing on words. But I don't know. Maybe in the Q&A, or my other colleague would really comment on this. The big question is, what has this trip accomplished in the hesitant alliance, hesitant superpower, and will it fend off China, Russia, and also Iran, which is President Biden accused of its shenanigans and destabilizing the region. So we really don't know what has this visit accomplished beyond trying to be, a PR campaign for President Biden to use it in his for his party in 2022 midterm elections, or for his election 2024. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Alshayji. And you have put out a challenge. Does everybody agree with your view that the reset is basically a failed reset, that Biden did not achieve most of what he set out to do substantively? Anna Jacobs, who will be next, will be commenting on how the smaller Gulf states and Iraq view this trip and Saudi-American relations, and how will they react in the short and long term to not only to the proposed regional missile defense plan, but the whole effort to reinsert America into the region. Is that something they'll welcome or something that they'll reject? Anna Jacobs, please enlighten us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be among you all. I'm coming to you from Qatar, so good evening to everyone. I have a bit of a different take on some issues, mostly because I'm thinking of it a bit from the point of view of some of these other countries. So, for some of the GCC+3 countries, I feel that the summit was an opportunity to also highlight intra-regional diplomacy and a desire for greater regional economic cooperation and connectivity. It was also, of course, as my colleagues have highlighted, an attempt to reset U.S. Middle East relations more broadly. But I think that the GCC+3 countries were eager to hear the U.S. president lay out America's new strategy for the Middle East. And these regional actors, I think, wanted to underline the opportunities relating to regional economic connectivity, as well as security cooperation. But of course, the president's visit to Jeddah was centered around reviving strained U.S. Saudi relations. And I think the other GCC+3 countries were very aware of that going into the summit. many promises were made by Biden, that the GCC+3 leaders wanted to hear, notably that the U.S. is still fully committed to the region's security and essentially promising that it's not leaving. However, as others have underlined, the question mark, for Saudi Arabia, for the other GCC+3 countries is what these commitments will actually look like in practice. But I do think broadly, these other countries, as well as Saudi Arabia, are hoping for more support from the U.S. on regional security cooperation, on regional diplomacy efforts, on regional economic cooperation initiatives, and generally on keeping tensions low. But time will tell if this, actually happens. Biden did have bilateral side meetings with the leaders of these other GCC countries and Iraq and others. And I would say that one of the more interesting results of the summit was the agreement signed to link the electricity grid of Iraq to the electricity grid of the GCC. This concept has been in the works for several years, and I think many are eager to see how and when and if this project will actually be implemented. This is something that would, provide great relief to many Iraqis. And then I think more broadly, other GCC+3 countries are especially eager to see what role the U.S. will play in investing in regional economic cooperation, as well as infrastructure. So the other sort of interesting issue that came up was the partnership for global infrastructure and investment, which is, viewed as sort of the U.S. response to China's Belt and Road initiative. So it's kind of, the U.S.'s attempt at economic diplomacy moving ahead, but it's unclear, again, what this will actually look like. And I think it's also crucial to note, as others have already underlined, that, these smaller GCC countries and Iraq are really the ones pushing hard for diplomacy with Iran. In the GCC, this includes Qatar, Oman, UAE, Kuwait. Qatar just hosted a round of indirect talks between the U.S. and Iran on the JCPOA. Iraq is also playing a major role in facilitating talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran. These countries do not want a war. They want regional economic cooperation. They want security. And I think that, this is one of the main reasons why we saw, Saudi, UAE, and others at the summit distance themselves very explicitly from any sort of Israel Gulf security alliance. Saudi Arabia may have implemented some, small measures vis-a-vis Israel, but as others have already highlighted, they are nowhere close to normalizing with Israel. Other GCC countries like Qatar, Oman, and Kuwait are also very far away from that. Iraq's parliament has even passed laws criminalizing relations with Israel. I think it's also important, to note that, during the summit, the GCC the GCC +3 notably all did emphasize the human rights of Palestinians, the continued Israeli occupation of Palestine, and a commitment to a two-state solution and the Arab Peace Initiative framework. Of course, this commitment is rightly questioned by many, given the normalization efforts taking place with Israel. But I still think that it matters a lot that it did seem to me to be a major issue for some of these other actors. And then the last sort of question on this regional security alliance. I mean, yeah, as others have already kind of mentioned as well, I think we are far away from anything resembling a sort of Arab NATO or an Arab Israel sort of anti-Iran alliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna Jacobs. You have given us a somewhat more nuanced view from the smaller Gulf states about the trip. And you've given us very good reason to be reading the next International Crisis Group report, having joined the International Crisis Group recently. We look forward to reading you as well as seeing you more often. And now I turn, last but not least, to Professor Douglas London. He is a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute and the author of a book called The Recruiter, Spying and the Lost Art of American Intelligence, published by Hachette last year. He's a 34-year veteran of the CIA's clandestine service who spent much of his career in the Middle East, but of course is now retired. And Professor London, others have touched on it, but we're asking if you would focus even more on this question of defense and security cooperation. Is it possible to rebuild the Saudi-American connection? I know the Saudis have been disappointed at times in recent years at American reactions to attacks on their oil facilities, as the UAE has been as well. And how can Riyadh and Washington overcome what appear to still be very real differences about Middle East conflicts? And what do you think the Biden administration can accomplish in the next 2 years with respect to Saudi Arabia and the Middle East more generally in security and defense terms?
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be among this panel of very accomplished people. And I think what it demonstrates to your audience, and certainly one of the takeaways should be, there's a lot of subjectivity to how you read this particular visit. And folks who all have great expertise are going to be able to highlight the pros and cons, but was there a clear winner? Should it even be looked at as a clear winner? In terms of Saudi-U.S. relations, and I think it's interesting, the title is Hope for a Challenged U.S.-Saudi Relationship. I would submit to you and the audience that relationship has always been challenged. The relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, if you want to go back to almost 80 years ago when President Roosevelt met with King Abdulaziz, has never really been an alliance, and it's never really been a friendship. More than anything, it's been an interdependence. It's been very much in the interest of both parties to work together where their issues overlapped, and issues overlap a great deal. But if you take a little bit of the longer view in terms of Saudi-U.S. relations going back through these decades of wars in the Gulf, oil embargoes, Al-Qaeda attacks on the United States, allegations of Saudi support for that, it's never really been perfect. It's a relationship that tends to bend pretty well and doesn't break. And as a practitioner of espionage over almost 40 years, and much of it spent in the Middle East and much of it in that region, I tend to believe that in the cases of espionage, international relations, and romance, actions speak a lot louder than words. Both parties got a fair deal out of this in terms of tangibles. I think the deciding factor might be the optics and the intangibles. And there's a great deal of concern in the United States and elsewhere, of course, that the United States, by having President Biden meet with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Sultan, really elevated the Crown Prince, helped to rehabilitate him without accountability for the murder of Khashoggi, for various human rights abuses that affect American citizens and passport holders as well, for the war in Yemen. But, you could look at it from the other side too, that the Crown Prince has had quite the learning curve, being one who tried to bring Qatar to its knees economically with the embargo, to saber rattling really with the Iranians, and seeing sort of that illusion of Saudi warrior traditions, and that he was going to go into Yemen and just quickly win the war in Yemen. That hasn't gone particularly well. And he's been weakened, certainly in terms of image, by the fact that attacks from Yemen, likely enabled, facilitated, if not guided at times by the Iranians, have brought questions about Saudi ability to defend itself and defend that of outside interests. The Saudis have spent untold billions, and I'm sure you could do a mathematical analysis, but in terms of defense, they're really dependent on the United States for defense technology and defense support. And despite the Biden administration's rightful criticisms and complaint about Saudi activities in Yemen and the humanitarian disaster there, and the impact on stabilization or lack thereof across the region, the United States has continued to supply the Saudis with at least armaments. The Saudis themselves, though, have been cutting back on defense procurements, and largely because of their own economic interest and the Crown Prince's need to keep his promises about diversifying the Saudi economy, getting it away from petrochemical reliance. And they've been going down about 10% a year in terms of defense expenditures. They're spending about $46 billion this year. They spent about 70 some odd billion just a couple of years ago. So defense cooperation, intel cooperation has always been ongoing, even during the rough times of late and the rough times as you've gone over the decades. And that's because there's really no choice. We see a lot of talk about a reset of the United States and coming back to the Middle East. When has the United States really left? I think, again, in terms of actions versus words, for better or for worse, whether the United States wanted to or not. And I think President Biden was serious. President Trump was serious, and probably, in fact, did more to reduce the United States posture in the Middle East. The United States is greatly tied to the Middle East. It's tied to it for political reasons, national security reasons, and a history that it's not one that we could easily walk away from. It's easy to talk about words and images of, the Saudis are going to get closer to Russia. They're going to get closer to China. How much are the Saudis going to trust the Russians as they get closer and closer to Iran? And would you really want to be buying Russian military gear and take their advice, given how they've done in Ukraine? I think there's probably more to Saudi defense cooperation with China, where they've shopped for things that the United States just cannot bring themselves and won't to provide in terms of ballistic missiles, research technology. And we've seen some evidence of cooperation on what's described as a peaceful nuclear program, but certainly something that not just Crown Prince Mohammed, but I think any Saudi leader would like to have some options are. I think the Biden visit did achieve a fair deal of the practical goals that he set forth to do. Saudi cooperation with Israel has gone on for years and years. It's always been in the shadows. They've been talking on intel. They've been talking on the military. I think what we're seeing now is a push the United States would like to see, and I think a concession Crown Prince Mohammed is willing to make to be a little bit more public. Are they going to be allies? Even the United States and Israel, even the United States and Saudi Arabia aren't quite allies. But there's integration, to use that term, but at least cooperation that serves the interest of all. Iran is still the principal threat to Saudi Arabia, has been since the revolution in '79, and will be for the foreseeable future. So it's clear that there's going to be continued movement forward in that cooperation in terms of early warning, in terms of intel cooperation, and some flexibility, because it serves their interest to tie their fate somewhat where it goes concerning Iran with the United States' biggest ally in the region, which is Israel, and then Jordan after that, and Egypt coming after that as well. So I think in terms of action, we'll continue to see some practical gains for both parties. The optics, on the other hand, Crown Prince Mohammed needed more than anything else the validation of being recognized as the current de facto leader and likely the future king. And I think Biden's trip certainly did help that. And both parties will spin it quite a bit. But, they've both had their pride having to be swallowed somewhat. Again, talking about Qatar and Turkey and Iran and in Yemen, the Crown Prince has had to stomach a bit of that and is, making some progress towards putting perhaps interest before needs. So in terms of, moving forward, there's still a lot of differences. The, Saudi Arabia and the United States see things differently in Syria, where the Saudis, like its Gulf neighbors, are willing to rehabilitate and take Abbas back in, Assad back in, that is. And in Libya, where there's certainly differences on which side of the government that both parties would like to see come out on top. So who won, who lost? I think there's a fair bit of winning and losing on both sides, but I think that both leaders got what they essentially set out to do. And now it's going to really be how things play out in the media and in terms of optics, in terms of perception. But consequentially, practically speaking, they both did well in the visit.
We have had a terrific array of different views, with Professor London just now suggesting that the two leaders did get what they really needed out of the visit, and that things were perhaps never as bad as had been perceived. I'm going to turn now to questions. I've been negligent in forgetting to ask you to submit questions, but we do have a few. And I want to ask, I'll comment first from personal experience. I was sitting in the Riyadh business class lounge at the airport 3 years ago, because of course I haven't been traveling much in recent years. And I was hearing only Hebrew spoken around me by people carrying those kinds of cases that you carry electronic equipment in. It seems to me that despite Saudi denials, the normalization process, not political normalization, not recognition, but the normalization process in terms of cooperation on internal security matters, maybe on air defense, that there's probably more than meets the general eye, and more than the politicians are willing to talk about publicly. And I'm wondering, especially you, Professor London, but others as well, whether you want to comment about that. And then also for Anna Jacobs, can you tell us a little bit more about what might be going on in these talks that Baghdad hosts between Tehran and Riyadh? Is that something real? Certainly, as you emphasize, the idea of electricity provision from Saudi Arabia to Iraq is a hell of a good idea that should have been done a long time ago. But does this enable the Iraqis to play a real moderating role between countries that, especially in recent years, haven't regarded Iraq as all that important? So let me start with those two questions.
So I'll jump in then on the intel piece. Absolutely, the Saudis and the Israelis have been talking for years. They've been sharing intelligence for years. It's been in their interests. It's to both parties' interest to keep it somewhat quiet, probably more so for Saudi Arabia than for Israel. But I wouldn't quite say partners, but they've certainly been helping one another out. And it's been a positive relationship, and I've only seen it grow. It's not isolated to Saudi Arabia. Before the Abraham Accords, if you look at the Emirates and the Bahrainis and the Moroccans, there was cooperation among them all. I think the impediment for Saudi Arabia is, in fact, political, as you say, and also while King Salman is alive. King Salman is the architect, if you would, of the Arab peace towards finding some resolution, which is a two-state formula, which is, recognition of Palestinian state and seeing to their rights. That generation is moving on, and I think Prince Mohammed's target audience in Saudi Arabia is younger. They're less concerned, they're less enamored with the Palestinian issue. There's even some holdover of some resentment towards the Palestinians going back to the first Gulf War in Iraq so many years ago. But I think it would be difficult and unlikely for Prince Mohammed to really normalize relations and open embassies and be more public while his father's alive and while he has to think about the political consequences. But there's cooperation and it'll keep moving onward.
I think you're on mute.
Apologies. I was just asking about the role of Baghdad as an intermediary between the Saudis and the Iranians.
Yeah, I will definitely get to that, and I just want to kind of echo what Dr. London just mentioned as well. I do think that countries like Saudi, as well as countries that have decided to normalize, such as the UAE, do have to walk a very sort of precarious tightrope when it comes to relations with Israel. In my view, it seems like they're viewing it as a bit of a insurance policy, a deterrence mechanism vis-a-vis Iran. But at the same time, they don't want these relations to antagonize Iran, which in my view is what would happen, which is why I think you saw the UAE, even though, again, it has normalized, they were among the main actors that denounced any sort of anti-Iran axis. So I think that's crucial to highlight. And so while I do think, obviously, relations are moving ahead in terms of, the UAE and Israel and even Saudi and Israel, I do think that they are going to proceed cautiously. And then on this question of the role of Iraq. My understanding of the Saudi-Iran talks, I think there have been 5 rounds now, and we're all sort of anxiously waiting to hear when the next one will happen. And they've said that it will happen soon, but we haven't heard. And then my understanding is that a lot of it is happening kind of at the intel level and is more focused on sort of pressing security issues relating to Yemen, among other issues as well. I think that track is one of the most crucial ones that we all need to watch. I think, Iraq's prime minister, I think, has done a good job in terms of facilitating these talks. I just think there's a big question again of what will come of them. And I think some people view it as, the Iranians are sort of highlighting them as an example of their regional diplomacy efforts, whereas Saudi Arabia is sort of downplaying them a little bit because they don't really see a lot happening out of it. One could argue, though, that they played some kind of a role in the fact that Yemen is now in the 3rd month of a truce. That's speculation, but there could be some relation. But I think the big thing that we all are waiting to hear is, again, if there's another round, and then 2, what will come of it. And I think on the Iranian side, I think the win would be Saudi Arabia normalizing relations with Iran. And then for Saudi Arabia, I think the win would be, I think, more support from Iran on helping maintain this truce in Yemen, which seems to be happening, but it's really hard to know what role Iran is actually playing in this now. So in my view, Iraq is playing a really crucial role. Prime Minister Kademi also hosted the Baghdad Cooperation Summit last summer, which was a multilateral one, and which welcomed representatives from Iran, from Saudi Arabia, and various other actors, which I also think is positive, even if it was very large and doesn't seem to have a clear structure yet. So I would just sum up and say that, in my view, Iraq is playing a very helpful role.
Thank you, Anna. Professor Alshayji and Professor Ulrichsen, I have two questions for you. One is, have we heard the last of human rights talk from the Americans in the Middle East? Is that just something that ain't happening anymore? And the second question is about Russia. Russia is really vital to OPEC Plus. And how firm, how concerted is that relationship? Should we expect OPEC Plus to do its best to keep oil prices around $100 a barrel, even as the current demand situation likely declines with the decline in the world economy? Those two questions for you, Dr. Alshayji. You're on mute, I think.
Thank you, Professor. Could you remind me of the first question?
The first question was about human rights. Is that a dead letter now in the Middle East? Do you expect the Americans to drop it? I remember my friend Abdullah wrote a letter to President Biden in which he said, "Forget human rights." Has Biden forgotten human rights? And is that what the Middle East wants?
Yeah, I mean, the issue of human rights is important, in my opinion, for us, but for the U.S. administration, as I said, security and stability in the region trumps human rights, as Condoleezza Rice and all other U.S. presidents and administrations have dealt with this issue. It shouldn't be a hindering block in the strategic relations or in their approach vis-a-vis the region. I mean, the State Department issues an annual huge report regarding the human rights issues in all the world, including Russia, China, and the Middle East, Arab countries, even in Israel. But that doesn't go very far. The issue of human rights, in my opinion, from a realpolitik approach from the United States, is not a hindering block regarding the improving, developing, moving forward with the relationship. It's a stick that the United States uses in order for it to appear as the champion of human rights all over the world. Even we see what Black Lives Matters. The United States is not the ideal country to come and preach and lectures other countries, especially what we saw what the United States did in Iraq, Abu Ghraib, and in other countries, bombing innocent civilians, killing innocent civilians. So United States is not in a position really to lecture the region and its allies in the region regarding human rights issue. And we take what the United States keeps saying about human rights with a grain of salt. And we know, I mean, it's using it as a leverage to suit its, its interest, its policy. And you remember the old saying when they told one of the U.S. this president in Latin America abuses human rights, and I think it was Roosevelt or Eisenhower, and blah, blah, blah. And he is a SOB. He said, well, he has at least our SOB. So the United States is not really in a position really to lecture other countries as long as we see the plight of minorities in the United States and how they are being dealt with. So I don't think it's going to be a hindering issue. It's going to be an issue that, it's being used in order to keep other countries in terms of in line regarding the United States. It's a convenient tool to be used between now and then, not any more than that. Regarding the second question, could you also remind me, please?
The OPEC Plus connection in Russia. Is this a permanent feature? Or are we facing a concerted effort to maintain oil prices at or above $100 a barrel?
Yeah, it seems like it. I mean, it seems like now we're talking, and President Putin is now visiting Tehran and meeting with the Iranians and with the Turkish president in order to be back on the world stage. And yeah, OPEC Plus is something that really we have to reckon with. Now, price of oil is going down, hovering around $100, which is fine. But United States knows very well that Saudi Arabia, particularly, has very limited spare capacity to increase its oil output in order to help President Biden bite the bullet and be able to say, well, look, a gallon of gas now is less than $5, and we played a role. I mean, to just soothing feeling to American voters, because as you know, midterm elections for all the House of Representatives and 1/3 of the House of the Senate coming up in the first week of November, and from all indications that it's going to be a slaughterhouse for the Democrats. And so he's trying his best to appear as the president and the head of the Democratic Party, doing something to minimize the damage and the losses for the Democrats, because he's going to be a lame duck president if the Republicans will regain the House and probably add one or two senators to their ranks. And that means President Biden will be really in big trouble for the next 2 years of his administration. And we don't want to antagonize the Russians, frankly speaking. Russia is a major player. We have not taken any major sanctions. The GCC countries and most of the region have not taken any major sanctions against the Russians. I remind you that the Russian Foreign Minister, Lavrov, was in the region and met with the GCC countries in Riyadh, I think a couple of months ago or less, during the Russian onslaught against Ukraine. And there hasn't been any sanctions or any even warning of taking any actions against the Russians. We're taking a neutral position. I think this is a smart approach because we don't know how long this war is going to go on, and it doesn't seem that the Russians will be cowed in any way to stop its onslaught against Ukrainians. So the issue of oil is important for us. OPEC Plus is here to stay. And also the Saudis and the other countries that have spare capacity could use it as a leverage in order to keep a good relationship with the Americans and not to antagonize the Russians on the other hand. So it's going to be a tool that could be used for leverage by the countries that have limited spare capacity. I mean, let me admit this. I mean, the Saudis have very limited spare capacity, and Crown Prince MBS was very clear to President Biden. We have $13 million we could produce, and this is the top amount of oil that we cannot produce or overproduce more than that amount of barrels per day.
Let me stop you there. Dr. Ulrichsen, human rights and OPEC Plus?
Well, I haven't got that much more to add, but I would say that the sight, especially of President Biden refusing really to engage with the family of Shireen Abu Akleh when he was in the West Bank, probably did as much damage to regional perceptions of human rights in U.S. Middle East policy as the 4 years since the death of Khashoggi have done as well, and perhaps also makes it more visible, that sense that there's sort of maybe a sort of double set of standards depending on the nature of the human rights violation and the identities of the perpetrators. And I think that's become, like with the sort of whole Russia-Ukraine conflict as well, it's become very clear that the US and maybe sort of Western perceptions often clash quite sharply with perceptions in other parts of the world about the same set of events, and that one set of perceptions certainly isn't necessarily a kind of global norm. So I think that's become much more visible. Obviously, the sight of Mohammed bin Salman raising Shirin Abu Akleh with Biden effectively saying, well, why didn't you raise that issue? I mean, that doesn't bode well when someone like the Saudi Crown Prince can be seen to be sort of lecturing a US president about human rights when the Saudi Crown Prince is himself a pretty credible serial human rights violator himself. And then just in terms of OPEC Plus, I would agree with Professor Alshayji. I'd add that Abdulaziz bin Salman, the energy minister of Saudi Arabia, was himself in St. Petersburg at the end of June at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, and in person he pledged that Saudi-Russia cooperation at OPEC Plus would continue. And I think both sides see value in that relationship. I don't think that either side sees any reason why it shouldn't continue even beyond the 2-year production agreement to restore oil output to pre-pandemic levels. And I think we're seeing the basis being laid now for the next phase of OPEC Plus. We had obviously the creation of OPEC Plus in 2016. We then had the pandemic, which actually began right after Saudi Arabia and Russia did engage in an oil output war, if you remember that, right at the beginning of the pandemic. But then after that, they've worked quite closely together. And I think we're now going to be moving into that next phase of OPEC Plus, where the Saudis, the Russians, and the members of the OPEC Plus will decide what to do in the next phase of what is now a very high oil price environment. So again, if President Biden had hoped that going to Saudi Arabia would perhaps change the calculations of OPEC Plus members, I just don't see that happening, at least anytime soon.
Very good. So very clear consensus that OPEC Plus is here to stay, and that the Americans are not in a good position to lecture anybody in the Middle East on human rights. I'm tempted at this point, if I don't have any more audience questions, to ask each of you perhaps to imagine a different visit by a president of the United States in current circumstances. What could Biden have done to make this more successful than our judgment has been so far? I think Professor Ulrichsen has already illustrated one thing he should have mentioned, and should have the murder of Shirin Abu Akleh, and he should have mentioned the abuses of the Israeli occupation. But what else might have been done to improve the effectiveness of this visit from the Middle Eastern perspective? Though if you want to comment on the American perspective, that's okay too. Anybody want to take that one on?
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead, Anna, go ahead.
Sorry. So for me, what I'm most interested in, and what I think would have been a much more interesting summit, would be one that's focused more around setting up a regional dialogue process that includes the GCC, Iraq, and Iran. I think making this all about normalization with Israel is an approach that will not help. I think it will increase the likelihood for conflict. I think that it would be wiser, or from my point of view, to have framed this as a summit on how to bring regional actors together. And I think especially the format of the GCC plus Iran plus Iraq is really what would help. And just to think through sort of the initial, not some grand regional security architecture, but rather what are some sort of confidence building measures that could be implemented. And I'm really actually hopeful or wondering if this is something that will happen later on. So thank you.
Thank you, Anna. As a participant in the Middle East Institute regional dialogues, which include the Iranians as well as the Saudis, other Gulf countries, and Jordan and others, I can be entirely sympathetic with this proposition. I think it's a very good one. But I'm not sure the Americans are in a particularly good position to be the sponsors of it. But Professor Alshayji, you wanted to intervene on this question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't think President Biden has really allayed the fears of the GCC countries during his visit. I mean, there is a lot of apprehension. The issue of aligning the United States once again very closely with Israel does not really help the image of United States or the among the population or the popular opinion in the region. He came out very, very attached to the Israelis as I stated earlier in my talk. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist. I mean, that was really a very provocative statement, and it wasn't the first time. I mean, he keeps repeating it for generation now. That was not really helpful. Not meeting with the family of Shireen Abu Akleh, as my friend Kristian stated, Professor Ulrichsen, was really a missed opportunity to try to show the issue of human rights that the U.S. keeps lecturing all countries in the world, but comes to Israel, I mean, there is off limit or it's off the table, and that really shows the double standards of United States and does not bode well for United States image in the region. He has not really, thirdly, he has not really allayed the fear of the GCC countries vis-a-vis the Iranians. I mean, Iran is not, there has been a lot of discussion and a lot of, even in the last GCC meeting, that the GCC countries should be part and parcel of any negotiations with the Iranians over its joint comprehensive plan of action, because we need to take the Iranian shenanigans and its destabilizing role, malign activities in supporting instability, its proxies in the region, its spying rings that we keep discovering. One of the largest was in Kuwait back in 2015 from Kuwaiti citizens from Shia backgrounds. That really did not help the United States being the country, the ally of the GCC countries. Taking off the Houthis from the terrorist list was really, from a GCC perspective, was a big blunder. That needs to be not only extending the ceasefire for another 3 months, which is good as a band-aid solution, but not as a comprehensive solution to the Houthis, who are, as everybody knows, a very malign proxy of Iran. So that does not really build confidence building measures. I mean, the issue of building confidence building measures from a United States to deliver to its GCC allies, who are very reliable allies. 3 of the countries in the region among the GCC states, the last one is Qatar, have been elevated to the level of major non-NATO ally. What keeps the, I mean, this is a question that I've been asking around here. It's the Bahrain, then Kuwait, then Qatar. Just last January, President Biden announced that he's now going to ask the Congress to designate Qatar as a major non-NATO ally for its, in my opinion, face-saving attempt and operations, and helping the Americans to be evacuated from Afghanistan. How about the other three, especially the major two powers in the region among the GCC, Saudi Arabia and the number one and number two economy in the Arab world? I mean, how about them being elevated to major non-NATO ally? What are the hindrances that prevent President Biden, as he designated Qatar, to do the same with Saudi Arabia and UAE, for instance? So the United States could play a lot of cards here to allay the fear, to stand up to Iran, to include GCC at least in some discussions regarding the joint comprehensive plan of action. But all of these issues were off the table. And in my opinion, this will build up more suspicion of United States rather than being on the same page regarding security issues.
Professor London, let me turn to you. You were less critical in a way of the results of this visit, but how do you think it might have had a better outcome?
I think the major obstacle for both leaders was they were seeing one another at all. President Biden had referred to Prince Mohammed as a pariah state, a thug, all sorts of disparaging language, and Prince Mohammed likewise bit back at that time, and as well as when the Khashoggi report came out. So the options was really logistics and spin. And I have the impression that the United States would have preferred to have President Biden meet MBS on the margins of a GCC summit that could have taken place elsewhere. But I don't think Prince Mohammed was going to go for that. And they still worked it out, at least here back in the States, as you've seen. Much of the narrative has been, well, the president was going there anyway to meet all these GCC leaders. And while he was there, since it was being hosted. So from practical terms, again, as I spoke to earlier, if you look at what they each got practically, they both did achieve many of the check boxes on their agenda. I don't think people have really looked closely at the tech cooperation that the United States and Saudi Arabia signed in various areas. That's a huge deal for both parties. For Prince Mohammed, my personal opinion is his success or failure will depend on the economy and his ability to diversify the Saudi economy and giving people a better way of life when things, despite their wealth, are not quite as well for the day-to-day Saudi than people, at least in the United States, think. They think all Saudis are rich. There's a terrible housing shortage that's been ongoing for years in Saudi Arabia. It gets in the way of people getting married and raising their families and such like that. So it's important for the prince to accomplish that, particularly since he's really compromised many of the sort of social contracts his predecessors had with the religious elite, with the tribes, and within the House of Saud by going on its own. So this visit was doomed to have great criticism depending on where you sit. It's hard to be objective. I personally think the United States needs to leverage the interdependence it has with Saudi Arabia to exact at least some greater degree of accountability. But at the same time, the reality of interdependence between the two countries is not going to go away. And are you simply not going to speak to one another? I don't think that serves either interest. Also, I think a key component of this is across the GCC, we talk about perceptions. There's no free press. There's no freedom of speech. Even with our non-NATO allies, there really is not. So opinion is somewhat shaped by the prerogative of the state in those countries and how they want to shape their own opinion. I think Minister of State for Foreign Affairs in Saudi Arabia, Abdullah al-Jubair, who's a professional, was around during the days of King Abdullah. He's good at his job. He worked loyally for King Abdullah. He's working loyally for MBS. Took pains not to make it look like a bad visit. Took pains to, I think, sort of massage the language of who lectured who. Did the prince lecture MBS? Did MBS lecture the prince? It's like, oh, it came up. They both touched on it, and then he moved on. So in terms of guarantees are tangibles. After the Aramco attack in 2019, even President Trump did very little to protect Saudi Arabia from the threat from Iran. they didn't forget that, even with their great love and adoration for President Trump. So I think tangibles are, will the United States continue providing intel assistance, military support, and a lot of the greatest progress made in that region, by all included, is made in back channels. The Israelis like everything up in public because it makes them look better. But the GCC states and Iran both like to take care of business in the shadows, which is why even Iraq, the talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran, as Anna mentioned, are mostly being done by intel people because they trust that establishment better to protect their secrets than the spectacles that often come with great diplomatic conventions.
Professor Ulrichsen, let me turn to you at the end and ask what could have been done better in this visit, but also to underline something Professor London just said. Can the U.S. do anything to help Saudi Arabia be more successful economically at home? It does face big challenges in the future. Is that something the Americans are equipped to respond to?
Well, I agree that Mohammed bin Salman will be judged by his people, I think, on whether he can or cannot pull off the economic transformation that he has effectively promised in Vision 2030. And I think that will be the key to whether he does eventually become king and remains king for 50 years, as his grandfather was before him. I think he needs investment. I think he needs support. I think actually, I would agree with Professor London that countries like Israel, which have a lot of high-tech knowledge and know-how of some of the very specific issues that do face Saudi Arabia in terms of arid desert economies and transitioning to other forms of economic diversification. I think that could be very useful, of course, high-tech as well. So I think building on that, this aspect of the visit might be more tangible in the long term and not focusing on kind of the bigger geopolitical issues, the sort of normalization at the sort of political and diplomatic level, just because for MBS and for so many else around the region, what counts will be how and whether they can move beyond the current economic model based on oil and gas in a time of climate transition, climate stress and energy transition, and into what comes next. And so I think that's what will be their point of judgment, and that's how the US, Israel, and others could work together. But as Anna said, for that to happen, they need to shift the topics that they focus on at these summits. They need to really begin to think about the points of commonality, the areas that they all share together, which are non-military, non-security, not just geopolitical, but are economic, technocratic, and that includes, I think, Iran as well as Iraq and the other countries of the region. So I think they need to think in a different way for a new set of issues that they're all going to face moving forward.
Well, let me draw things to a close on that hopeful note and thank the panelists and the Gulf International Forum for giving us this opportunity to have a rather fine-grained and nuanced picture of the Biden visit and the prospects for the future in light of that visit. Thank you all very much, and I will adjourn this meeting until the next time we have an occasion to meet, which I hope will be soon.